Hello, everyone. You should be coming in with muted and potentially your video off as well. So don't feel the need to turn that on if you don't want to. We are working with a meeting Zoom rather than a webinar, but we are going to make it work. We will get started in just a few minutes. We're waiting for some more people to join us. So we will start a little bit after 7. We have, just to make you guys aware, a chat feature at the bottom of this webinar. So if you have any questions for our presenter today, please be sure to send those our way. And toward the end, we're going to have a short Q&A session. If you have any questions, you can send them to our presenter. Looks like we have a few more people joining us. And this is our first Zoom webinar series. So I'm sure there's bound to be technical difficulties. Hopefully you guys will bear with us as we kind of work out the kinks on our first one. Okay. It looks like we have a majority of our participants online, so we will get ready to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we really appreciate you guys taking some time out of your evening to spend with us and talk about women's suffrage, which the 100th anniversary is this year. Obviously, COVID has kind of put a wrench in things. So, we are bringing this program, which we had hoped to hold in person, virtually to you guys. So, thank you for attending. As a welcome, this event is sponsored by the Clinton County History Center, which is located in Wilmington, Ohio. And it is our mission to preserve and promote and educate the community on Clinton County history for the benefit of all people. So we are doing this in partnership with Dr. Emily Krichbaum, and she's actually a former professor of mine. So it's very nice to see her again and have her here. Emily, thank you so much for joining us. So, the Clinton County History Center, you guys probably noticed that this event was for free. We did not charge admission to attend, and we are not making money off of this event. So, I do want to point out that with COVID-19 and the coronavirus effect that it has had on our nonprofit, we are always looking for donations or support. If you guys are interested in supporting the Clinton County History Center, you can visit our website, which is listed on the photo on your screen, clintoncountyhistory.org. There is a shop/support tab on our website, and you can actually support us online. Or our P.O. box is 529 Wilmington, Ohio, and we always accept checks. So if you guys would not mind supporting us, because this event is for free, we would greatly appreciate it. So to give you guys a little bit of an introduction on Emily, she is an expert in American women's history and politics. She earned her doctorate from Case Western Reserve University and has authored numerous articles on the 19th Amendment and 20th century reformers. Her most recent work on Elizabeth Cady Stanton will be published by University of Notre Dame Press in 2020. So hopefully that's still on track with coronavirus. For 10 years, she taught at Ashland University, where I had the pleasure of being her student. She received both the Female Faculty Member of the Year Award and multiple Mentor of the Year awards. In 2018, she founded Remember the Ladies, which is a nonprofit organization that helps teachers in school districts incorporate more women's history into American history classrooms. She presented her ideas on the TED stage in 2019. And Emily currently serves as the department chair of history at Columbus School for Girls. She also teaches as a faculty in residence for POWER's new leadership program at the John Glenn School of Public Policy at the Ohio State University, as well as Rochester Institute of Technology's Center for Statesmanship, Law, and Liberty. Emily currently resides in Bexley with her husband, Brian, and their English setter, Greta. So with that, I will give over the powers to our presenter. Give me just a minute. Okay, Emily, you should have controls now. Let me know.
All right, I believe that I do. You may still be sharing your screen though.
Okay, give me just a minute.
No worries.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I would like everyone to collectively lower their expectations at this moment, because sometimes when I hear that, I'm like, oh, who's speaking? That sounds intense, but alas, it's myself. I am so excited to be here. One, because it's just wonderful being able to be reunited with former students and to see them flourish in the way that they are. And these are always the dreams of history professors, that students will appreciate and understand the value of history. So thank you, Shelby, for inviting me. I also am very thankful for tonight, because I do think that the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment has gotten a bit shortchanged from 2020 and the pandemic. And I can only imagine how Alice Paul or Elizabeth Cady Stanton would feel or think about these moments. But thankfully, we're able to celebrate to a certain extent. So the plan for tonight is I have a a short presentation. And my hopes of this is that we generally, I believe, have an idea of the history of women's suffrage. And my goal is to provide you maybe with a few new things that you may not have heard about in the traditional narrative of the women's history and history of the suffrage movement. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen. And Shelby, when you said there were that there'd be technological problems, I'm taking as a challenge that there won't be. So I'm a very competitive human being. So we are going to do this seamlessly, my friends. All right, let's see here. Slideshow, play from start. All right, so I want to make sure if you could just nod your heads if you see the PowerPoint presentation on your screen. Thank you, I really appreciate that. All right, so celebrating the 19th Amendment. As you know, this is the 100th anniversary, and I provided that image because I want to show a little bit more texture and dimension to the story that we know, and fully appreciate all of the individuals that were involved in this story. Traditionally, we tend to look at the start of the women's suffrage movement in 1848. And part of the reason why we place it then is because that is when the Seneca Falls Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, and also where the Declaration of Sentiments was written. And for those of you that probably already know, the Declaration of Sentiments was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. But instead of colonists writing to King George III about all of the rights that had been violated, all of their natural rights that had been violated, and Thomas Jefferson lists them, right? He provides all of the historical examples of the way that Great Britain violated their rights. Women in the Declaration of Sentiments acknowledge that all men and women are created equal. And instead of colonists saying we deserve a different relationship, right? We don't need some guy in a crushed velvet robe sitting on a throne telling us what to do. Women are saying, we're not sure we agree with this relationship that currently exists of men and women. Essentially, what they were saying is women should not become civilly, economically dead when they marry, that they should still have those same rights. So the Declaration of Sentiments is written in 1848, and I would argue that that was really the intellectual foundation of the movement, that it was the first time that individuals organized and came together. And while you can say that certain things are amiss, or that there are problems, or that there's something not quite right, it's an entirely other thing to organize and to bring 300 people together, men and women, and to state what exactly it is that's wrong, the reason why it's wrong, and the solution, right? We can all say that we don't like something, but in order to change something, that takes a heck of a lot more work. So 1848, we have the Declaration of Sentiments that's been written. The individuals that are there, by and large, are familiar with the reform movement. This is nothing new to them. In fact, you have 4 out of the 5 women who had the Seneca Falls, who really organized the Seneca Falls Convention, were anti-slavery organizers previous to this. So many of you probably know Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example. She met Lucretia Mott on a ship on the way to London. Now, the reason why they were going to London is they were attending the International Anti-Slavery Convention. What you might not know is that they didn't know one another previous to this, and the only reason why Elizabeth Cady Stanton was on that ship was because she was on her honeymoon. Now, some people go to Hawaii for their honeymoon, and other people go to international anti-slavery conventions, right? I mean, this is how intense her husband, she wasn't necessarily familiar with the movement all that well yet, but her husband was a devout reformer. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton's on this ship, recently married, and she meets Lucretia Mott, who is the Quaker woman of the abolitionist movement. She will not wear cotton because that is a product of the institution of slavery. She will not serve sugar on her table because that is a product of the institution of slavery. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton's just in awe by this human being and has this immediate girl crush. And she's listening to what Lucretia Mott has to say, and she's the yes girl. She's like, you're right, I agree. Yes, absolutely. And they become immediate friends. Stanton can't wait to hear what Lucretia Mott has to say at this International Slavery Convention. They go in. Mott is a delegate from the United States. Stanton's husband is a delegate from the United States. They walk into the convention hall. They speak to one of the men there, and one of the men says, oh, you're going to give a speech? Yeah, we can't have that. We can't have women addressing men here. In fact, we're not sure we can have mixed crowds of men and women together at all. So there's a curtain. Right, if you see right over there, if you could just sit behind that curtain during the convention, we'd appreciate that, just to keep things nice and tidy. And so as they're sitting behind this curtain, right, they were all revved up in their conversations going across the Atlantic. They're sitting behind this curtain and hearing about the equality that individuals are striving for Black men and women, and how they should be treated as equal, and how they should have a voice, and how they should have a seat at the table. And these women behind the curtain are like, this feels pretty wrong for us as well. And Stanton will continue on in her reform movement when she fights for women's rights in comparing the plight of the white woman to that of the enslaved man, which is problematic to a certain extent. The ultimate thing she was trying to say is simply there wasn't much autonomy. Anyways, they come back from the anti-slavery convention and they say something must be done. And then they part ways. And then Stanton has multiple children. But years later, in 1847, they come back together, and by 48, they have this Seneca Falls Convention. So this is this general starting point that most historians say the first wave of the feminist movement. And you can see here some of the individuals that are listed. Frederick Douglass was one of the few men that had attended this women's rights convention, even though Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband was an anti-slavery advocate and a politician. When he heard that Stanton, or as many that knew her well called her Lizzie, wanted to hold this convention and wanted to help run this convention, he left town. He said, I'm trying to run for office, and you're going to make a mockery out of me and my campaign if you hold this gathering. Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is quite possibly the most stubborn human being in American history, and she did not care and had the convention anyways. And she wasn't even on speaking terms with her father because she was wearing bloomers. She was wearing pants. So she was just an ultimate problem for every male relative she had. Anyways, the Declaration of Sentiments in Seneca Falls Convention. One thing you may not know, however, is the fact that many of the women that were in attendance at the Seneca Falls Convention were deeply inspired by the women of the Iroquois Confederacy. In fact, when Lucretia Mott went to visit her sister in New York, she spent weeks with many of these Iroquois women and were incredibly inspired by them. Some argue it's because of this inspiration that you might be able to make the timeline of the American women's suffrage movement with the start of the Iroquois Nation 1,000 years before that. Because when Lucretia Mott, among other suffragists who visited the tribes, and you're like, how do you know they visited the tribes, Emily? They wrote about it in a lot of their suffragist journals and newsletters. And they wrote letters to one another stating that they see these women and they participated in major decision making. They could veto, these women could veto any act of war. Women selected the chiefs and could remove the chiefs. women could disqualify or remove a chief from office if he was found guilty of murder, of theft, or of sexual assault. Now, one of the arguments, like, why would women have this great amount of power? What was it about women? And it's argued in the tradition of the Iroquois Confederacy, they believe, as they are right, that women are the givers of life. They are the ones that create the life. And so they're the ones that should have control over the decision of whether to protect that life. In other words, if women are the ones that bear the children and raise the children, shouldn't it be the decision of women to see if their men go to war or not? Is this a just and worthy cause? Or are these men just getting excited for a fight? The other place that women's authority came from in the Iroquois Confederacy, in part, they controlled their national treasury. Think about it. Native Americans' national treasury was corn, beans, squash. The women were the ones that farmed. And so being in charge of vast tracts of land really meant tremendous power. So again, just one connection here, and we'll continue. Another thing you might not know, I would argue that one of the reasons why the women's suffrage movement may have not, or maybe could have been more effective, is if it had not splintered in the late 1800s. One of the reasons why you see this splintering is because discussions over the 15th Amendment. Now, let's go back a little bit. In 1848, you have the Seneca Falls Convention. You have organization throughout many states. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, in New York, pushes for a bill that when women are married, they can retain the property that they had when they went into the marriage. Okay, so there's a certain amount of progress that's being made. However, as many of you being good students of history know, Civil War breaks in 1861. And like many times in war, even in World War I, when W.B. Du Bois says we need to close ranks, we need to stop any protests or any reform movements and dedicate our energy and efforts to winning the war. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among her friends, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, decide that's the right and patriotic thing to do. Let us prove that we are good, upstanding citizens so that after the war is over, we will have earned those rights as citizens to vote. And so they band together and they raise money for the Union cause and they send supplies to troops and they prove their loyalty to the Union and to the Stars and Stripes. Once the war is over, there's a discussion of Reconstruction. There's a discussion of how do you bring this country back together, this war-torn country. And what do we do with these 4 million newly emancipated African Americans? Now, Frederick Douglass would say, don't do anything with us. You've done enough, right? But there's this question of how do you secure justice or a certain amount of justice for the newly emancipated people? So the 13th Amendment is passed, which officially abolishes the institution of slavery. The 14th Amendment is passed, which acknowledges the rights of citizenship and citizenship, federal citizenship, not simply state citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment is for Black male suffrage, or making sure that race will not be held against someone for wanting to vote. In discussions of the 15th Amendment, before it's voted upon, individuals like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton say that women should be included in this. Frederick Douglass disagrees, among others. Now, Frederick Douglass was at the Seneca Falls Convention. Frederick Douglass is pro-women. He's very, very excited about the idea of universal suffrage for all. However, the reason why Douglass, among others, was against women getting the vote is because if you added women into the 15th Amendment, it likely would not have passed Congress, nor would have been ratified. It was dramatic and radical enough that Black men would receive the right to vote, that adding something else on simply wasn't prudent. Here's the other way of thinking about it. I know I oftentimes thought about this in undergrad and figured it out only by reading a certain book in graduate school of the political necessity of Black men voting at that specific time. When the Civil War is over, the number one thing on people's mind is, at least if you're in Congress, is we're bringing senators, we're bringing representatives from the southern states back into Congress. How do we make sure that this war doesn't happen again? Right? Like, what's changed? It's not as though the South has reformed, right? It's not as though they've changed their ways. They've just lost. It's like I tell my students, you know, if you lose a basketball game or a football game, it's not as though you say to the other team, well, that's correct. We're not worthy. You are so much better and so much more superior, right? You're like, no, let's do this again. We can win this time, I promise. So when the Civil War ends, the South sends congressmen to DC, and you want to know who shows up? Alexander Stephens is knocking at the door of Congress, and he was the vice president of the Confederacy. You can only imagine the headaches that these senators and representatives had in thinking, didn't we just go to war with you? Weren't you the vice president of the nation that we just defeated? I mean, I can't, it's like the Yalta Conference only on steroids. I mean, it's a nightmare, right? So here's the question. Well, first of all, Congress refuses to seat those congressmen, saying, we're not doing this again. It's like a toxic relationship, right? We've been there, we've done that. We're not going down that road again. So they refuse to seat representatives from the southern states. What's on the minds of Republican senators, of Republican congressmen is, we need to make sure that the Union is stable. What is one way that we can make sure that individuals like Alexander Stephens don't make it back to Capitol Hill? Not by allowing white Southern women the right to vote, because there's probably a good chance that white Southern women will still vote for Alexander Stephens. But if you allow and you enfranchise Black men to vote, there is no way that a newly freed Black man will vote for the former vice president of the Confederacy to go back to the Capitol. Are you following me on that? Right? Side note, Alexander Stephens is the one who gave the speech when they were like, excuse me, Mr. Stephens, could you explain to us as to why the Civil War is happening? He goes, oh, well, the United States had the Constitution and all those things, right? Except for one thing, this whole idea of equality. Yeah, the cornerstone of our Confederacy is going to be that all people are unequal. Anyways, all of that to say, I'm sure that there were senators and representatives in Congress that wanted Black men to vote just because they believed in universal suffrage. I also believe they wanted to have a stable union, and it just didn't make sense for white women to be a part of that bill because the focus was on stability of the union. And you can see here in the slide this back and forth of discussion, because what ends up happening, it gets ugly. At first, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton said everyone should have the right to vote. But when they find out that they're left off of the 15th Amendment, they start working from an environment of scarcity, that if we can only pick one group, we should pick the most intelligent and civilized group. Douglass says, I must say that I do not see how anyone can pretend that there is the same urgency in giving the ballot to woman as to the Black man. With us, the matter is a question of life and death. And then he continues, when women are fearful of being dragged through the streets because they're women, maybe we can talk about it. Anthony responds, and this is in person saying to one another, not through letters. The old anti-slavery schools say women must stand back and wait until the black man shall be recognized. But we say, if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of woman be brought up first and that of the black man last. From this, you have a split in the American suffrage movement. You have the National Women's Suffrage Association, made up of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And then you have the American Women's Suffrage Association, Lucy Stone, Frances Harper, Frederick Douglass. And so that's one of the reasons I would argue that it took so very long for the 19th Amendment, among other things. Although African American women are not pictured in much of the primary sources of the photography that we have, it's important to note individuals like Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a staunch justice reformer, anti-lynching journalist, investigative journalist, a muckraker, if you will. She started her own newspaper, in fact, to expose many of the issues of the South, specifically of lynching and the individuals that were lynched, not deserving said lynching, but instead are targeted because they proved to be economic competition to white Southerners. 3 of her friends, in fact, had started a grocery store that had started to create great competition with the local white grocery store, and were lynched by the local community because of that. Ida B. Wells fought valiantly in the suffrage movement. And while many of the suffragists acknowledged her as equal and acknowledged her organizing efforts, when there were public parades, they asked that she either A, not march, or B, march in the back of the parade. Now, part of this, again, could there have been racist white women in the movement? Sure. I also believe that that's not a complicated enough response. What I mean by that is it's politics, right? Politics are politics. And if you want the 19th Amendment to be passed, and if you need 36 states to ratify an amendment, you're going to need at least one Southern state. And there are very few ways that Southern states have progressed by that point. And so white women were willing to acquiesce on racial justice for the sake of getting this amendment passed eventually. Now, if we really want to talk about when we start cooking with gas, and I never fully understood that term until I moved into this new home of ours, which is actually over 100 years old, the distinction between stoves. The moment that the movement really starts cooking with gas is when Alice Paul comes onto the scene. Now, Alice Paul, pictured here on the right, she's a member of the National Women's Party. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, so you had said the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, but what's the National Women's Party? The National Women's Party was started by kind of the next generation of suffragists. Those that, as many of you may have experienced, the younger generation looking at you and saying, why are you doing this way? This doesn't make any sense to me. Or as my 16-year-old students just look at me and think I'm bizarre for my general presence, right? So they're questioning why the individuals before them, like Carrie Chapman Catt, would go to meet with President Woodrow Wilson, would sip tea with Woodrow Wilson and say, is today, Mr. President, the day that you will back women's suffrage? I'm not sure I'm ready for that, Carrie. okay, Mr. President, thank you, and leave his office, right? And kind of do this very polite song and dance. This was a group of women who was much more radical and believed that if you really wanted a movement to gain ground, that you needed to get into the press. You needed to make a scene. You needed to raise your voice a little bit. Now, of course, I agree in part with Alice Paul and the National Women's Party that it's important that you get the media on your side. But we also need to acknowledge the 70 years of the foundational organizing and grassroots movements that had occurred before them. The National Women's Party held a suffrage parade the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. There were so many people that were drawn to the parade that when Woodrow Wilson appeared in DC and stepped off of the train, there was hardly anyone to greet him. And he asked why. And that was because they were all at this parade. Now, the parade had invoked so much violence and such brutality against certain individuals who protested that there were investigations afterwards. People were incredibly upset, men and women, watching these women step out of their place, out of their appropriate sphere, and asking for the right to vote. What was even more upsetting, remember, this is during World War I. The National Women's Party had a strategy to protest a wartime president. Now, today, that may not seem that drastic, but when you have questions of sedition and the Red Scare throughout the United States, and you're in World War I, a group of women hosting a 24-hour picket outside of the White House, this is unheard of. In fact, many of the women in the National Women's Party held up signs calling out the president by name and saying, Mr. President, you are so worried about these Germans. Take the beam out of your own eye. You're worried about the voice of Europe. 50% of the American population does not have a voice. If we're going to call this a war for democracy, then we should have our own war for democracy on American soil. Eventually, members of the party are arrested for obstructing traffic on the sidewalk. They appear in court and are asked to pay a fine. Paul says, I'm not paying a fine because that would suggest that I'm guilty of something. And many of these members are put in jail at a type of work camp. Alice Paul's trying to figure out ways to keep the story of women's suffrage alive and to continue to protest. And so she refuses to eat and stages a hunger strike among other members of the party. As an aside, for those of you who have not seen it, Iron-Jawed Angels, starring Hilary Swank, it was an HBO film, I believe HBO film. Very good and actually documents much of this. But they staged a hunger strike. And eventually one of the members of the National Women's Party, her husband, who was a politician and a journalist, was able to write about what was going on in these work camps, because after they staged a hunger strike, they were force-fed by the officers in the jail. Between, again, the foundation that was established from years of organization and protesting and attempting to get women's suffrage in the state-by-state method, because remember, many states had earned the right, many women had earned the right to vote in various states, combined with the more radical tactics of people like Alice Paul. Towards the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson throws his support behind this idea of the 19th Amendment and women having the right to vote. But of course, it's not simply the president. We need to have Congress vote for this 19th Amendment. The House of Representatives votes yes. The Senate votes yes. And now you need 36 states to ratify, 36 states to approve this amendment. So here is the question. Will it be ratified? Will you have every state sign on? Well, the quick answer to that is no. Every state will not sign on. By midsummer of 1920, 35 states had ratified. 8 had rejected the amendment. And of the southern states that were left, North Carolina had already said, we haven't voted yet, but we're not going to vote for it. Many states said they weren't even going to hold a ratification session to do anything, not vote it up or vote it down. They wanted to let it die. So the only shot, side note, Ohio ratified in June 16th, 1919. So I'm thankful that we were one of the good guys, one of the early ones. But it was down to Tennessee to be the 36th state by August of 1920. What was common for the time was these national suffragists to go from state to state and to gather around the State House and to try and strum up support weeks beforehand and to try and persuade the state legislators to vote for women's suffrage. On the day of the vote, there are women that are in the gallery of the State House, and they have white roses and they have yellow roses. And they pin a white rose on every politician that says he is not for women's suffrage, and pins a yellow rose on every politician that says that they're going to vote for women's suffrage. So just from a view, they're able to tell if they have the votes or not. As they're voting, it's very clear that they are short one vote. They, being the suffragists, are short one vote. Harry Byrne, pictured here, the youngest state legislator, he's 24 years of age. He was wearing a white rose. He was not for the 19th Amendment. But at some point during the voting process, I'd like to think that it was right before he was voting, and people run in and say, Representative Byrne, we have a piece of mail for you here, please read it. I don't know when it was, but it was sometime during the vote. And he opens it up, and it's a telegram from his mother. And his mother, I mean, the irony, says, I have heard many arguments against women's suffrage. They are quite cruel. I'm paraphrasing that. But what she does say specifically is, be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. Love, Mom. With that, he takes off his rose. He casts a vote for women's suffrage, and the 19th Amendment is ratified by a southern state, by the youngest state legislator. Again, not to suggest that the man is the one that brought in the victory, but in this moment, the man had to be the one to bring in the victory, and so we'll allow it in this presentation. One thing that I do want to mention before I answer any sort of questions, and I appreciate your attention. I know that I don't sound like Morgan Freeman when I speak, so you may be, I will keep this as short as possible in this last statement. But women, by that fall, were able to vote in the presidential election with Warren G. Harding and James Cox. Well, every state but Mississippi and Georgia. In an effort to prevent women from participating, they refused to extend registration deadlines to allow women who were enfranchised by the 19th Amendment to cast their ballot in November. So there were still states, even though the 19th Amendment had been passed, they said, well, you may be enfranchised, but you didn't register to vote, and we're not going to change our laws for you, so you're just going to have to wait till the next presidential election. It also should be acknowledged that while this is an incredibly wonderful piece of legislation to celebrate and an amendment of the Constitution, it would take decades for universal suffrage, whether that be Chinese women to be acknowledged as citizens to then have the right to vote, Native American women, or African American women. But it's important to recognize and to celebrate those that organized and led the reform movement so that that journey could start in 1920. Thank you so much for your time. And if anyone has any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Thank you so much, Emily. We appreciate your time. So if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Kind of scroll down and it should pop up and say chat, and you can select that and then message us to leave your question, because we do have you muted, so we're not going to be able to hear you if you are going to verbally ask a question. Okay, so I can actually I'm gonna unmute you guys so then we can just do it verbally. Give me just 1 minute. Okay. Okay, everyone should be unmuted. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask?
I do.
Yeah, Jan, go right ahead.
I really appreciate the Zoom conference, and Emily, I think what you did was absolutely fantastic. My comment is more of a comment. Back on the first slide, you were talking about something about when that was the 1847 slide on, and you were talking about how women could, I can't remember how you worded it, women cannot own property, or they couldn't own property, how you worded that. In 2015, when my mother passed away, one of the lawyers in Wilmington put her name and my two sisters and my name on the deed. I didn't think anything of it, and most of you may not know this. Karen Buckley was our lawyer. And it turns out that in Ohio and in 12 other states, if your name is on a deed, you can't just sign that. Your husband has to sign it. It's not funny, believe me. In order for me to deal with the house and to sell the house, I had to get power of attorney from my husband, my sister, her husband, my other sister, and her husband to be able to do anything with the property. Now, this is 2015. How many of you knew anything about that? Yeah. It's stunning that in this day and age, something that you talked about in 1847 happening is, there's 12 or 13 states that still do this. So I was speechless when Karen kept repeating it to me. I'm like going, I'm not getting this. I'm just not understanding it, because I thought everything would be fine. And it's obviously
go through your sister's husband to do something.
Pardon? What'd you say, Christine?
Just muttering.
I was too, trust me.
But I do have a question if there's an opportunity.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm not going to say anymore.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. Good to see you. I was just thinking, I had done some reading, and that there was an issue about women running for and voting for school board candidates. Do you know about that? Have you done some research on that? There were certain places, states, that women demanded the right to run for school board and therefore to vote for school board. So how did that fit into the whole movement?
No, absolutely. That's a great question, because one of the things that you start to see at the turn of the century is this argument that women should have the right to vote, not necessarily because they're equal. That won't be their train of thought. Women should have the right to vote because they are more moral and more pious and more righteous, right? This original kind of traditional gender roles, that the reason why women raise the kiddos is because they're naturally more inclined to do so. And so they carry that and they say, well, if we're naturally more pious and more righteous and more religious and more all these things, and men are the ones that like go out into the world and get their hands dirty, right, in politics and business and bars, all that stuff, then shouldn't we deal with the kid stuff, right? Shouldn't we be the ones that determine who serves on the school board? Or shouldn't we be the ones that, Jane Addams actually used the term municipal housekeeping, right? That if we stay home, right? If women stay home and they rear these excellent sons and daughters only to go out into a city filled with sin and vice, what's the point, right? So Jane Addams would go as far as to say that you should run for local office, right? That because we're the keepers of the children and the family, we should continue to do these things outside. But I love your question because it does speak to the nuances and the differences depending on the local or the state level, right? Depending on if you lived in Wyoming, you had the right to vote in the majority of elections, right? If you lived in certain cities, they may think, that's a pretty good argument about school boards. Yeah, you can vote and you could probably run, but that's it. Let's not get crazy here, right? You're not going to run for city council or for mayor. Heavens to Betsy, you're not going to vote for president. So, but yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Emily, my question is, Ohio, you mentioned the state of Ohio and how, we were in this. Ohio at the time was a leader in so many things at that time, and we were a powerhouse. Did the state, were they a leader in this, or did they just kind of sit back and say, oh, we'll just let this happen? Or were they was the state as a whole pushing for it?
Generally speaking, by this point, the majority of the northern states were going to ratify. There wasn't as much concern. In fact, there was a more there's more regional divide in this than might be expected, although generally speaking, the southern states aren't the most progressive as a whole, right? Even when it comes to divorce laws and those sorts of things. Whether Ohio spearheaded or not, when I tend to think about these things, it's more about the individual reformers, right? Who were the ones that led the charge, and were the pressure groups that put it on the state house to make the decision and to vote. It wasn't necessarily the politicians who were saying, we need this to happen, and can we rally votes? I think a lot of men at this time were trying to diplomatically figure out what would hurt them the least, right, in their votes. I'm trying to put this as best as possible, but it wasn't necessarily this passionate cause per se, right? Because for them, nothing's necessarily changed. Harry Byrne, it's like, well, I don't want mom to be mad at me. But I understand your question, and I think it's a really smart one. I can't speak to it one way or the other if, Ohio, after passing it, says, and we now look to Illinois, right? But as we all lead the charge as, the moral center of the Midwest, or fill in the blank. But I'd be interested to know that answer as well. Anyone else?
Anyone else with questions? Okay, well, I think we will wrap it up. We're 5 minutes till 8. So Emily, I greatly appreciate you taking time out of your evening to spend with us. Everyone that attended, I really hope you enjoyed this event, even though we couldn't have it in person. I think we actually had a wider audience than we would have, at the History Center. So it was a pleasure having everyone tune in tonight. We are hoping to do more of these webinar Zoom features in the future. So please stay tuned on our social. Now that I have everyone unmuted. we, we are hoping to do more of these, so please stay tuned on our social media and then our website, clintoncountyhistory.org. If you guys are members, we did just send out our third quarter newsletter, and we included an influential Clinton County women piece that I had wrote as director, and that talks about the movers and shakers, the women in Clinton County, and some of the first women on school board, the first suffragettes in Wilmington and Clinton County. Yes, Jan's holding it up. Thank you. So if you're a member, you kind of got that extra piece of knowledge as well, local history. So if you're not a member, you can find out more about that on our website. And I thank you all so much for attending. With that, I will say good night, and we wish you all well. So thank you.
Good night. Thank you, Emily.
Right.
Very
That's very good.
interesting.
Thank
Great.
you.
Good job. Claire.
Mhm.
Jan's a